right, good afternoon. Glad everybody, hope you had a good lunch. It's always a challenge to be the presentation right after lunch, but we're going to try to keep it lively and engaging and hope you all will engage with us as well. My name's Aaron Lacey. I'm actually pinch hitting. Angelo had a matter that came up, so I'm going to do my best to sit in as your moderator today. Patty made the comment earlier that a lot of the lawyers in higher education, they're either in-house or out-house. I have spent the majority of my career in the outhouse of higher education law with Thompson Coburn. So glad to be here. And it just so happens that a big part of my practice is merger and acquisition work. So glad to be leading what I think is going to be a extremely interesting conversation. Let me introduce our distinguished panel. I'll start. We've got two Kevins today. So you can't remember a name. Yes, Kevin. That's a good bet. We'll start with Kevin McDonough, senior member of the higher education practice at Cullen and Dykman LLP. Did I say that right? Dykman? Yep, very good. Concentrates his practice in higher education and not-for-profit law. And really, Kevin, you do everything for institutions of higher education. In addition to mergers and acquisition, governance, student affairs, faculty issues, very wide-ranging practice. Fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah, fair to say. An important practice aspect of Kevin's practice, though, is representing institutions that are exploring and or pursuing merger, acquisition, and partnership opportunities with other institutions. And I'll also just note, served 4 years on active duty in the U.S. Army, attaining the rank of captain, correct? Congratulations. Thank you for that. And then we'll move on to Greg Mandel, currently Senior Vice President, Provost, and Laura H. Carnell Professor of Law at Temple University. Yes, sir. A leading international scholar on intellectual property law, innovation, and the interface among technology and law. And if you look at his everybody's got their full bio in your materials, and a lot of conversation about a lot of articles, written recognitions, and all the work you've property law. Prior to serving as provost, Greg was dean of Temple's Beasley School of Law for 5 years, and also has been very involved in various merger and acquisition discussions in the higher education space, particularly in recent years. And I know we'll bring a lot of that, as will everybody, to bear as part of the conversation. Our second Kevin, though not the second in any ranking other than just second being announced, Kevin Cavanagh has been a leader in higher education and in the industry for almost 30 years. Has served as the chief enrollment officer at 5 different institutions, right? Manhattan University, Iona, Mount Sinai, Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and the College of New Rochelle and Bloomfield College, among others, and the last 2 having been engaged in merger and acquisition type activities, and currently lead consultant with Higher Ed Consolidation Solutions, which is one of our sponsors, right? Very good. In these roles, oversaw, particularly in the last 2 roles, New Rochelle and Bloomfield College, pursued a strategic merger, teach out partner arrangements, and doing that quite a bit now in the current capacity, right? Yeah, very good. And then last, but certainly not least, Mike Newman, which since 2009, Mike has served as SVP General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at the 19,000 student strong. Is that still the right number? Higher, lower? Yeah. Touro University system. And I love this in his bio. It says the system includes at least 10 legal entities, 6 OPEIDs, and 25 campus locations. Only a Title IV higher education lawyer would make a reference to OPEIDs in his bio. So I love that you have that. And that's the Office of Post-Secondary Education. I oversee compliance affairs, including responding to regulatory accreditation matters for the university and its merger and acquisition strategies. And finally, I got to include this, recently received his EMT certification and is trying to perfect his Australian abseiling technique. Did I get that right?
Repel when you go face down.
Face down rappelling. All right, fair enough. How similar is that activity to being an attorney or a general counsel for an institution of higher education? Does it feel
Always falling face
down? So it's very, very similar. So we've got a Q&A format this morning, and I'm going to start out with a question for Mr. Cavanagh here. How has the business of higher education really changed over the last 5 years?
Well, good to be with you all. I say I'm a recovering college executive after spending 20 cabinets and otherwise, but no, have not been to a cabinet meeting in 18 months. But in my observation in the schools that I've worked for, there's a number of factors that are pushing colleges forward, having to have more strategic discussions about mergers, affiliations, acquisitions, teach outs, shared services models. And there's no one thing. But I put together a quick list of some of the things that I think college executives are kept up at night by. It's the combination of many of these things. Not every school is being fronted with these, but many are. There's the fragility of higher education in general. 40% of the schools in the United States right now have under 1,500 students. When you think about inflationary costs and otherwise trying to be when you're bringing in that little revenue, and it's only going to get harder to talk about enrollment trends. Dated business model. Many of these schools are operating in business models that were built in 60s, 70s, 80s, and haven't been able to innovate or haven't thought to innovate. And now they're being pressed to think quickly on how to sustain their mission and how to sustain their institution. Changing demographics. There's plenty of information now that current students are going to college. There's fewer students that are graduating from high schools in the U.S., especially in the Northeast and Midwest and other parts of the country. And that's, if you took a look at a map of where many of the higher education institutions are located, it's in those areas because that's where the population was. But as the populations are shifting, there's not enough students around those campuses. And most of those campuses, both your private institutions and your public regionals, are all really drawing from those regional areas. So again, it's a downward pressure on the revenue of these institutions. There's technological disruptions. As I was sitting in the back before, I saw one of the billboards right outside, Southern New Hampshire University, a small little school in New Hampshire 20 years ago. And now it's one of the biggest online players because they grabbed the brass ring 20, 25 years ago. And the concept of online learning was not perceived to be as high quality, but they and others entered into that market, and they were able to sustain their on-campus small environment by creating a huge technological infrastructure. Many colleges didn't do that, and now they're up against schools like Southern New Hampshire, Arizona State, and others that are grabbing more of the market share for alternative learners that, adult people that didn't go to college but are looking to come back are not necessarily going to go to the local regional college and university. They're going to go to a more convenient, either time or financially, and the online space is filling that. And not every school has been able to get up on it, and there's some big players there. Obviously, challenging finances. We've had the recession that changed the finances on many schools and the perception of higher education in the minds of many people. We had the COVID pandemic more recently. Many colleges were living off of some of the HERF money and other funding that the universities were receiving during that time. Some used that money innovatively to think about new programming or otherwise. Others didn't, and they just ran out of that cash, and now that support is no longer coming. It's further complicating the wall that they're hitting, especially as we're dealing with inflationary costs. Changing perceptions in higher education. Students and families do not want to take the level of debt that they used to pay for their undergraduate degrees. The federal and state governments are funding healthcare and infrastructure at a greater clip than they are higher education, at least traditionally. And again, that's impacting these colleges. I don't need to get into the regulatory pressures. I didn't know until about an hour ago that there were 297 federal regulations in higher education, but that speaks for itself. And again, many of those regulations are unfunded. So it's increasing the costs on the college side at a time where net revenue per student is going down. So over the course of the last 12 years or so, there are about 3 million fewer students studying undergraduate, four-year colleges and universities in the United States. And that is likely only going to grow as this demographic cliff that we're hearing is hitting these colleges. So that puts small colleges, regional colleges in a position of how do we look toward mergers and acquisitions as a vehicle by which we can sustain our mission and our heritage. And for the universities that are better capitalized, larger, and have scale, the M&A space is an opportunity for them to be more competitive in their regional market as they're facing some of these same demographic and other financial headwinds. So all the same headwinds, but it's resulting in two different activities, those that are looking to be acquired and those that are looking to do the acquisitions. And that's just a few of them. I don't know if anybody else on the team has anything else to add.
I have a couple of other points that about the changing landscape that do not necessarily deal with mergers and acquisitions. It used to be that higher education, everybody thought it was staid. It's now very, very dynamic. Accreditation used to be a partnership with the accreditor. Now they're playing the game of gotcha. Students used to embrace their professors, and now in their education, now they have Gallup poll says that the more than 50% in 2015, more than 50% of the population thought that they had quite a lot of confidence in higher education. Now that number is 57% don't have confidence, do not have a great deal of confidence in higher education. You have all these these confluence of factors, and you have a degradation in higher education. And when you have a changing demographic outlook, that is going to negatively impact prospects.
I'll make sure this is on. I'll add maybe 2 points to the great summary that Kevin just provided and Mike added on to. One is on the demographic cliff, just to give it a little more texture, because it's a phrase we all hear. And you see different projections, but roughly speaking, we're at the beginning and part of a decade when the number of high school graduates is supposed to decline by about 7% in the country. And that might not sound like a cliff, maybe that sounds more like a slope. The real impact comes not from that number, but from the likelihood of these students going to college. And if you look at predictors of students going to college based on various demographic factors, that number is actually supposed to decline by close to 20% we're in the beginning, we're in part of a decade during that. And that's sort of the real cliff when you hear that phrase used. Now, of course, that's a predictive model. We'll talk about this more. That's something we may be able to change, right? And mission-driven universities can work on changing that for the good of society. So one piece that I'd add is that. And the other piece is that there's just much more competition. And a lot of the pieces that Kevin mentioned and Mike mentioned play into this, the technological disruption and other factors. But another sociological thing that's changed is students are much more willing to travel more to go to college. So it used to be the case that, except for a sort of handful of nationally recognized schools, many students would stay locally, and so you had smaller, contained geographic competition. What we're seeing now is across many more categories of students, there's national competition, and so the competition among universities for students, due to the financial pressures, due to everything that was mentioned, is just becoming more and more intense, and so that adds to the challenges that are facing higher ed.
Let me ask, so you were speaking just now very rightly about demographic cliff. So, demographic numbers nationally and regionally, that would be something one would think that schools should be looking at more generally. In addition to that, and I'll sort of direct this, Greg, to you and Mike, what are the criteria, what are the data points that board members and administrators should be watching for sort of in this new marketplace?
Yeah, so there are a couple characteristics here. One of the things that I'll start off with and that we'll weave through our conversations is that when we talk about mergers and acquisitions in the higher ed space, what we're seeing a lot of tends to be smaller schools that are struggling financially and wait too long to think strategically about what they should do. And so I think one important piece of advice is for board members, leadership of schools, to think about what those pressures are looking like, what their challenges are, how likely they're at significant risk. And the factors that identify a school that's at significant risk aren't going to be too surprising. If you're seeing declining applications, Declining yield on those on the students who admit is a strong predictor. Schools having to use their endowment to cover operating costs should set off alarm bells to board members. Start to think about what's the strategy. How are we going to approach this situation? So those are some of the factors I think board members, it would be useful for them to be aware of.
I would just add that board members should also be aware of persistent negative operating margins, higher than 35% discount rates. You mentioned enrollment. Rural colleges are under more pressure, specifically because historically research indicated that individuals used to go to college within 50 miles of their home. That is no longer the case. And when you have a substantial deferred maintenance, that is also a warning sign. I would also add that board members should become steeped and knowledgeable about the economics of education, and specifically the economics of higher education. I have some books in front of me. One is Mission and Money. If I was going to be a board member, I would read that book, as well as books on economics of education. Very helpful.
I had a colleague who spent her career in nonprofit, and she used to say, just because we're not for profit doesn't mean we're for loss. And it's always wise to keep in mind, if you're running in the red for too long, no organization can really sustain that, right? So a couple of important numbers on the balance sheet. Greg, we're, I suspect, going to talk a lot about distressed institutions. As you mentioned, that's driving a lot of the M&A that's occurring in higher education. But let me just ask, at this point, at the outset, what types of institutions might benefit from some of these changing dynamics, and for whom might there really be an upside here?
Yeah, no, that's a great question also. And I think maybe I answer it in two big categories, and I'm sure my colleagues will have some to add as well. But precocious innovators are going to have advantage in this space, almost by definition. When you have an industry where there is a lot of disruption going on, a lot of change going on, a lot of challenge going on, institutions that are more agile, that can move quicker and think about new solutions, innovative solutions to some of those challenges, are going to have a strong advantage. Now, it's rare that you get to use the phrase agile innovation in the same sentence with universities. But I think one of the things that's happening is that we're being forced to, and I think this is a wonderful thing, we're being forced to be more innovative and to think more strategically. And I think that's really beneficial for the whole sector. So schools that can address that are willing to take some risks, right? Not all, almost by definition, and as was mentioned in my intro, this is something I studied the law for law and innovation. Almost by definition, in order to innovate, you need to be willing to take more risks. You need to be willing to let some of those fail. Because if you're being too risk averse, you're not going to be trying out new systems, new models, new. So that's one of the things I think we're seeing in the space, where some universities are being more innovative, trying out new models and having some success with them. I think ASU is one example. We're from mentioning Temple, but I'll give ASU credit in that space. So one category can gain from the current challenging environment is innovators. And the other category is sort of, exactly the opposite of the distressed institutions that we talked about, which are larger, relatively stable institutions. If you have more stable balance sheets, an endowment, if you have the availability of capital, the blunt reality is that the fact that some institutions are distressed may give opportunity for acquisitions, transactions, opportunities to move into certain areas that, if you're strategic about it, if an entity is sophisticated about it, we can take advantage of, that didn't necessarily exist before, right? Because the idea of M&A in the higher ed space 20 years ago was extraordinarily rare, relatively unheard of. And now folks recognize it might be a possibility. It's become more acceptable. We're seeing much more action in terms of mergers and acquisitions in higher ed now than we did 20 years ago, 10 years ago. We keep seeing acceleration.
So first of all, just want to compliment you all. You did a great job coordinating your tie colors today. I was just looking at it's amazing the diversity. I mean, I don't think this was planned, but kudos because you really knocked it out of the park. Mr. Cavanagh, coming back to you, so we've talked about these, tuition discounting, pulling money from your endowment, these various red flags or data points that probably signal maybe some sort of distress on the horizon. But I think this next question it might be probably maybe the hardest question in all of this. So congratulations, because it has your name next to it. Yeah. So understanding that there are these indicators, how and when does an institution begin to address the challenges?
I'm gonna dodge the question and say who, because I've seen different scenarios of, is it the executives at the institution that are seeing the enrollment declines or these budget gaps? We don't talk about it much in this context, but some of the other things that we can see is the turnover of staff on the administrative side or thinning of staff, and you have administrators and staff doing multiple jobs because it's attrition as people leave the institution. So there are administrators that see this happening in front of them. And do they decide to take some action by exploring activity that can sustain their institution? And I keep going back to that phrase of sustain. That's very often what sort of the point here is. Other scenarios are board members who have a fiduciary responsibility and need to ask questions and be informed. And are they seeing these reports coming from the enrollment committee, finance committee, or otherwise, say, hey, I think we have a problem here and we need your executives to guide us in this. So and for me, it really comes down to, are we paying attention to finance? Talking about whether it's enrollment or finance, we're talking about financial measures. These are all things that, first of all, you can see in your audited financial statements. You can see many of this in your 990s, publicly available. So it should be at the knowledge of these executives and these board members. And for the schools that are really distressed, and they ask the question, where do we start? Or how do we begin this? Or are we in as much trouble as some people? For me, it always comes down to the question that they ask is, how much time do we have? And I would argue that time is defined by liquidity, cash flow. And I've been a part of institutions, and I've seen institutions that I've worked with as a consultant who have grand ideas of doing more fundraising that is beyond the pale of anything that they've ever done before. So they're gonna get Belinda Gates to give them some kind of gift out of the blue, and it's gonna rocket their liquidity, and there's going to be no restrictions on that. It's going to be all dropped to the bottom line to cash, and that's unrealistic. I have other folks that say, well, we have plans of spinning up new academic programs, and we talked about this at lunch, but the reality is you don't see really the returns on a new idea on a new academic program, perhaps for like 36 months out from where we are right now. And you consider writing the curriculum, getting peer review, going through the curriculum committee, getting your accreditor to approve it, get it into your marketing team, because you can't market programs until they're approved by your accreditor. Market for 9 months or so, get your first cohort, typically take a loss on that first cohort, not until the second cohort that you start making revenue. And that could be 3 years out. And if your cash flow dictates that you only have 18 months left, then why are we even talking about spinning up new academic programs? So I think it's the red flags are the financial pieces. And then it's who is taking the responsibility of advancing the conversation. Is it the executives bringing it to the board? I've seen that and been part of it. Or is the board realizing that they've got some fiduciary risk and are demanding the executives to take action? And there's probably a number of different scenarios in between, but that's where I think we start.
And let me ask you a follow-up, and I'll start with you, open this up to the panel, slightly off script here, but there are opportunities if you see some of those indicators. I mean, the title of this session is, mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations, but that is not the only path you might choose if you're trying to address financial distress or other indicators. So let me ask you this question. At what point, or is there a particular point or a particular set of indicators that should prompt, whether it's leadership or a board, to specifically be thinking about merger or acquisition versus, you know, to your point, fundraising or trying to go out and do some sort of partnership or, you know, find some other contractual, some other solution that's not actually involving a third party, you know, in a merger acquisition type stage?
Typically what I've seen is it goes back to that cash flow concept. It is all of the possible ideas. It could be articulation agreements with other institutions, affiliation agreements, shared services models. There's a whole host of strategies. But all of those strategies take different periods of time to effectuate change and a positive impact on your college's finances. So it goes back to that, in my mind, cash flow piece. And what is the menu of strategy that a college can use to strengthen itself? What is the likelihood of that strategy being as effective as you need it to be, given the resources that you have to put behind it? And how much time is it going to be? And then you can start checking things off the list. So yes, we had this instance at Bloomfield. Bloomfield College, where I worked, was a predominantly Black institution over in New Jersey. Small school, about 2,000 students, but we were running into this cash flow issue. But the board didn't see it quite that way. And they advised me to go do more of that enrollment stuff that I do. Just go get more students, and that's going to fit. Or the fundraising folks, they should be doing more fundraising. Or the athletic director should spin up more athletic teams. I mean, and it was always when one of us was out of the room that they came up with a suggestion that would hit our verdict. So we as executives locked the board in a room for 7 hours. And we gave exhaustive presentation with data of all of these different strategies. And we brought in real estate experts. We brought in fundraising experts, third-party validation to show our board that continuing as a standalone steady state and just trying to optimize is an unlikely strategy. And that's when they finally had the aha moment. We could say, we think we need to find some kind of strategic partner. And that's the euphemism that we use, because we didn't know if we wanted to be acquired, if we wanted shared services or what. But we at least then got the board's attention to say, now's the time for us to start exploring something that's out of the box in higher education that they had never seen before and that Bloomfield had never seen before. And that's what resulted with the merger with Montclair State University. So that's it's
a complicated and challenging moment in time, and there are a lot of different, like I say, a lot of different options and paths, contingencies on the table. Mr. McDonough, so we've talked about this idea that maybe, you know, these red flags have popped up at an institution. Maybe it's the board, maybe it's an executive team that realizes that it's time to start initiating a conversation, trying to do something. Who all should be involved in that conversation at an institution? Which stakeholders should be involved when you need to address these financial issues?
So the obvious point in terms of when to start is as soon as possible and not waiting until you have 6 months of cash flow left. I've worked with Kevin on a couple of matters and other transactions, and one of the most important first questions that we ask when we get brought in is what's your financial runway? And schools that think that if they've got a couple of years that they're okay because now they've got time to plan, they're not closing next year. And I know this isn't about closure, so we won't focus on it too much, but 2 or 3 years is not enough. And if you're getting those 2 or 3 years by one-off things like transactions or a gift is going to get you there. One of the articles I was reading to get ready for today had a quote about that if you are looking at sustainability is that you're able to get into the next year, you're just not looking at it the right way. So in terms of stakeholders or interested parties, because this is the higher ed audience, I think you know almost everything about higher ed seems to be a lot more complex than it used to be. When you talk about a merger, consolidation, or an acquisition, and all the decision making that has to go in, and all of the different stakeholders and interested parties that have interests that aren't always aligned and sometimes are actually at odds, it's a very complex process, the regulatory, the operational, the financial aspects. So I wrote down a list of who I think are some of the clear interested parties or stakeholders, but I don't think this list is exhaustive. But obviously, the leadership of the school, faculty leadership, whether that be the union or the faculty senate, union representatives, major donors, student leadership, alumni leadership, bondholders and lenders, depending on where your campus is located, the community, the neighbors, government representatives. I think if you're a school that's out in a rural area and you are the institution that the community relies upon for employment, for taxes, culture, you're much more intertwined, and it's probably a much different decision-making process, or at least a different set of stakeholders that you would have maybe in an urban setting. My experience has been in the last 3 years where I've closed 3 schools in New York, and then I got to work with Kevin on a miracle. And the reason I mention that is those schools were all what you read in the press, where they were smaller schools, tuition dependent, small endowments, enrollment challenged, and all 3 began with setting up partnership committees or strategic option committees. But a year out, before they got to the awareness that closure, unfortunately, was a potential path, they were all looking at partners. And the problem they had, the challenge, was that they just waited too late. And so luckily, you've got a variety of experience. Temple, Touro, institutions like Northeastern, they get to look at this more strategically. And I know Mike's going to discuss that aspect of it later. So from my perspective, those stakeholders, although ideally you want to involve all the stakeholders as soon as possible, in those institutions that I've worked with, where at some point they are, it's almost a dual process where they're trying to still find a viable path with a partner or some kind of relationship, whether it's a merger or shared services, anything that will give them a future. But at the same time, having to deal with the issues that get more and more weighty as you go on, and you see that your path is getting smaller. And the reason I mention that is because I think that what happens in those cases, as opposed to somebody's got the benefit of really just looking at mergers for strategic purposes, is that you're afraid to share the information. You're afraid that word's going to get out, and if things get public, that it takes away options. You might not be as attractive a suitor. You might start losing employees and faculty. And so that's a factor that I just would suggest that you think about if you're in a situation like that, where you would not be afraid. And I think it's actually, not to jump ahead, it's an easier environment right now because there's been so many closures, and everybody knows that all the schools face mostly the same enrollment challenges. And it's easier to have these discussions, and that stigma isn't there. And so I'll just close by saying that one of the fascinating things that I see, and I think it's just different in every transaction, going to whether it's the board, the executive committee, the senior leadership, the president, every transaction has a life of its own, and you don't see it immediately, but after a few months of working with the board, you get to see who the leaders are, who the people with real knowledge are, the dynamic between the board chair and the president, and depending on the transaction, sometimes it has been the board chair or somebody on the board, just because they have certain business experience that the academic may not have. And I think as a lawyer, when you're in that situation, whatever the type of transaction, it's something to be conscious of, and try to help to facilitate making sure all the people that need to be involved in the decision making are, and not just the I don't mean this derogatory, but the loudest voices on the board that aren't always the best advice. So, but that dynamic of watching how it develops at each institution is fascinating.
Sure, no one here has a board with a loud voice. That is, what are the odds? Okay, so we've talked about, and here, you're responding specifically to sort of financial issues and financial distress. And we also talked about the fact that when an institution may find itself in that situation, there may be a range of options available to it. But again, the title of the presentation is Mergers, Acquisitions, and Consolidation. So let's talk a little bit more specific about the merger marketplace, and understanding deals involving institutions that are experiencing distress is one kind of transaction. Let me ask Greg, you and Mike, maybe to give us a broader look at what kind of transactions are taking place right now in the marketplace, including distress, but also apart from that.
I'll start, or you want?
Sure. Someone wants to be part of that closure number. In 2023, it was 15 institutions. 2024, it was the equivalent. Nobody wants to be part of a closing institution. What were the success stories over that time? In 2021, you had Northeastern take over Mills College. Mills College was sitting on approximately $1 billion of real estate in Northern California. Do I think Northeastern was the best partner? No, but Northeastern is an institution, a dynamic institution that had a team in place that was ready to capitalize on Mills. You have Montclair and Bloomfield in 2023. You have the likes of Touro and New York College of Podiatric Medicine just 2 weeks ago. It's finding the right prospect. That's what I call this overture and prospect. You're trying to find the right prospect so that it will be synergistic and accretive to your institution. Either they have a program that would take you, as Kevin indicated, they have a program that would take you too long to bring to market, and you can do it more cost effectively by acquiring this institution that has a mere engineering degree, but otherwise has low enrollment. They have a wonderful campus, low enrollment, and so it doesn't have the critical mass. They built the campus to sustain baby boomer generation, and they simply don't have that critical mass on campus. So it's finding the right mix, the right value propositions, your institution, but also the right mission, the meeting of each mission. And I think that's where the devil is in the details, finding the right economic mix, right programmatic mix, right mission mix that drives a good position.
Yeah, really well said. One of my pleasures for me of being on the panel today is that I actually began my career in practice in law doing M&A work. Was at a little boutique firm in New York that's called Skadden. Some of you may have heard of it. And so it's fun. It's wonderful to come back to New York for the day. I never expected the M&A work I did in practice to circle back and be useful in higher education. But in this role, it turns out it has been. Maybe what I can add a little bit to what Mike just provided, all which I agree with, some overview thinking around M&A that I think is useful. And I think one of the keys to take away here is that, right, M&A can be work that sort of sounds sexy, it gets good press. Successful mergers are really hard. And I'm not talking higher ed here, not even getting to higher ed. Just across industries, they're really difficult. The estimates that are that about 70% of mergers are not successful, meaning they don't end up achieving whatever the strategic objectives of the merger were. They don't tend to be accretive. Markets know this. There's something actually called the conglomerate discount on stock market valuation, which is that unless synergistic values are really seen when a merger is announced, after the announcement, the combined stock market prices of those companies on average go down, right? And that's because, statistically speaking, mergers tend not to work. Why is that? Well, culture is a really difficult thing to bring together. Institutions develop their own cultures. That combination can be very complex. There's a lot of interpersonal, organizational dynamics that come into play and make it all hard. So what's interesting in this space to me is that folks who have studied mergers in general have come away with a number of qualities that tend to make mergers, again, I'm just talking large, more successful. What makes them more successful? What makes them more successful is when you have repeat players, folks who are in the business of doing multiple acquisitions over time, have a team developed in-house that's focused on acquisitions, knows how to do it, has learned the know-how from how to do that. They tend to be more successful when they're smaller scale. It turns out there are actually relatively few cases of sort of co-equal size entities that merge, and very few of those are successful. It tends to be more successful. It's a larger entity bringing in a smaller. So that's a bunch of characteristics in general. Now we talk higher ed, right? Up until the last couple of years, has anybody heard of a university? Right? It's a repeat player in this space that has a team devoted to mergers and acquisitions. Of course not, right? It's not something that happens. So it's not surprising that mergers tend to be not unsuccessful in higher ed. And most estimates I've seen is that they're less successful on average in higher ed than they are in private industry, where, as I said, 70% of them don't work out. All that being said, there's real potential attraction to them, right? If they work out well, you may be able to provide students with new academic opportunities. You may be able to get synergies that tie into your research and your programming. A lot of cases where you may want to expand geographic presence, and that can be a valuable opportunity. You may be able to accelerate new capabilities. The online learning example, I think, is a great one there, and one that we've seen play out in several regards in the industry. But the bottom line of all of this is that for a merger to be successful in the higher ed space, you really want it to be strategic. I think we'll talk about this a little bit more later in our conversation. You really want it to be thought out, intentional, both institutions hopefully thinking about what they're trying to get. And what you just heard from my colleagues on the panel is that a lot of the M&A that we're seeing in the higher ed space isn't that strategic. It tends to be opportunistic. It's smaller schools that are really struggling financially, and they should have thought about this 3 years ago, and then 2 years ago, and then 1 year ago, and cash on hand is collapsing, right? And so they have to find the lifeboat, and then I think often the acquirer hasn't necessarily thought about it strategically, though. The opportunity just presents itself, and they take a look at it. There was an institution called the University of the Arts in Philadelphia that closed about as rapidly as any school has closed last spring. And we were in some very last-minute discussions with them just to see if we could save the institution, figure out some kind of relationship. And that was in the press a lot because the school closed so quickly. It got some national attention. And even though no formal transaction took place there, we did take a lot of their students. We are in a bankruptcy bidding process for some of their real estate, but no formal relationship took place. But the fact that we're in the news about it means that now we get contacted all the time by these distressed institutions. And the story is the same almost over and over and over again. When Kevin was just talking about the cash on hand, we were talking to one school recently. I certainly won't mention the name. They had about 60 days cash on hand, which is insane from a liquidity perspective. And to be really blunt about it, we were still negotiating really hard. They were explaining to us how they, when we look at this data, they're going to double the fundraising annually that they've had each of the last 3 years, and that's going to be part of the solution. And it's all these other pieces. I think when we share these stories, it's over and over again. The stories about boards not being aware is a common situation. So these are really struggling institutions, but where there should be more activity in the space is being more strategic.
Yeah, no, we were talking about beforehand when we were chatting the challenges. And one of the great challenges in M&A in this space is that, particularly where you have institutions that are smaller institutions, they may be geographically isolated. They may not have a single accountant or lawyer on their board. They may have no one who has ever done a transaction. And on the other hand, 90% may be alum who feel very strongly about the institution and don't want to be the ones on hand that give it away. So it can make for a very challenging governance dynamic. Do we see changes in the space that are occurring right now where affiliations may occur under different circumstances. Mike, Greg, sort of pitching that to you guys as well.
Touro deals a lot with its affiliations. I find the affiliation, it's the first step towards a higher and better collaboration. I am a fan of the merger. So I will do anything to try to get a merger to happen. And I find that an affiliation is the entree, is the opening the door, the dating before getting engaged, before getting married. And that's the way I view affiliations. It's a step in the process for me.
I ask you, how do you define the difference between affiliation and merger? What's the differential in your mind?
We have many research institutions. In the last 2 years, Touro has acquired 2 research institutes. First is Lovelace, and the next is McLaughlin Research Institute. And those both started off as affiliations. And so you get to learn about the other, you get a peek under the hood, as it were, as I believe an affiliation should be used as a peek.
And in this context, affiliation is like a contractual relationship.
Yes.
Not a, we don't mean under common ownership affiliation. We mean like a
That's correct.
contractual relationship. Yeah, understood. Yeah, understood. Mr. Cavanagh, turning back to you. So we're sort of talking about, we're in the mergers and acquisitions context, and we're going to break this up and talk a little bit about the acquired entity. We don't use target. It's not collegial enough. So we'll say the acquired entity, and then in a minute, we'll talk about the acquirer on the other side of it. So focusing on the acquired entity, what are the potential affiliation transaction structures? There are a lot of different ways that you can do this.
Well, I'm going to let the folks with the legal training get into the various structure types, but we've talked about contractual affiliations, managed services agreements, joint ventures, sale and controlling interest, sale and acquisition. We don't have this on here, but I've seen some schools explore the concept of sale leaseback of their entire campus for a period of time to explore, give them cash to operate, and then explore relocating or otherwise. So I think, again, I'll let the rest of the gentlemen on the panel talk to the legal aspects of these, but those are some of the different structures that exist.
I'm just going to some of the points Kevin just raised with regards to management services agreements, what I call, again, always aspirational transition services agreements, because I'm always trying to make the merger happen. You need to be concerned about third-party servicer rules. Again, when you're doing a management services agreement, you're getting that peek under the hood. They're using your optimization. You can have a great back office. Let's go to a metric first. Well-run colleges, well-run universities use 15% of their revenue for back office. Extremely poorly run colleges can run upwards of 45%. So what is the value to that poorly run, that struggling institution if they can lower their cost base, both overhead and systems? You can leverage your back office, your finance, bursar, financial aid, those back office operations to propel the other entity forward, and they get that cost savings. Meanwhile, you're getting the best peek under the hood available. So that's where I think, again, it comes with its complexity. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. But this management services or managed service or transition services, as I call it, is one way to get that peek under the hood. Then you have the joint venture, and I love joint ventures, although Touro has not yet done a joint venture. The optimal joint venture to think about is edX between MIT and Harvard, and they spun that off to 2U, and they just made bank. So, and then you have the sale and acquisition that can take many forms. My favorite is the membership substitution, where you're keeping that value of the OPID number, and it's best used in the not-for-profit world, and you're just placing a member on top of it, And then you get this consolidated entity that is bigger and better. And again, if you do your integration properly, then you should have project managers running this before day one, from the time that you're sending a MOU or a term sheet. Somebody should be modeling this, and we'll talk about this later, and trying to project manage an integration strategy so that there is a seamless day one plus post close and the team.
Well, if I can, I'll just add a couple of comments here. I mean, I think for purposes of this conversation, it's important to note that you sort of have relationships that are not mergers or acquisitions of any sort, but are based on some sort of contractual relationship, like an education affiliation agreement or articulation agreement, services agreement, all of those kinds of things. And I won't say those are not regulated at all. Certainly, if you have a relationship where some other entity is providing a certain percentage of your, those can fall within regulation, federal regulation, credit. But those are, as compared to a merger or acquisition, largely unregulated relationships, right? Whereas a merger and acquisition, you're not talking about a contractual relationship between two existing entities. I mean, what you're talking about is one entity selling itself or giving its assets essentially to another entity, and then they come under common ownership and control. And that's a very different concept, and that is a regulatory event, the federal level with your creditor, with your states, and that's an enormously complicated process. And that's really what we're focused on today primarily. But then even within that bucket, I'll say, of mergers and acquisitions, one of the things that sometimes gets lost, there's this idea from a corporate perspective, what's the transaction look like, right? You start with two separate 501c3s. Are you going to end up with one 501c3, or are you going to end up with two where one is the sole member of another? And there's sort of this idea of what's the corporate structure going to look like after the transaction. And then separate from that is the question of sort of from a regulatory standpoint, how many institutions are we going to have, right? So you could structure a transaction where after the merger or the consolidation, two separate independent institutions of higher education are sitting inside of one 501c3. They could both continue to operate as two independently accredited and authorized institutions of higher education, notwithstanding the fact that they're inside of one corporate entity. Or separately, part of the plan could be, subsequent to the transaction and them coming under common ownership and control, one is going to surrender its identity essentially and become, say, a branch location or a division of the other entity, which will be the sole surviving independent institution. So you've got the corporate concept of a merger, meaning like where we take two corporate legal entities and put them together. But then a separate consideration is, how many institutions are we going to have after this transaction is completed? So it's very complex, and there are so many different ways that you can go about accomplishing this. But I wanted to make sure to draw this distinction between relationships that are not a merger or acquisition, but are a contractual based relationship where you're trading services or partnering or something like that. And then this other idea of where we're actually merging and combining two corporate entities, and then ultimately maybe two institutions as well.
So I just wanted to add something kind of related more to what Mike was saying, because it's not a consolidation or an acquisition, but in terms of relationships that are alternative to that, what I've seen in several instances recently is where healthcare systems in New York, different parts of New York, will partner with a college. And one client I had partnered with a healthcare system where they're going to fund a new physician assistant program because in their region, they were short on those physician assistants, and they're going to split the costs of it with the idea that the higher education institution will get clinical placements and the funding to start up the program. So there's other ways, and maybe that'll lead to something more down the road, a different type of transaction. One that I'll touch on later, but just got a lot of publicity when Concordia College closed. They sold their campus to, it was Iona College at the time, in Iona University. And this was in the paper. They repurposed that campus in a sense where I think that Iona may have had a nursing program, but they turned Concordia, which was 2.5 miles away, into a health services institute with 20 or $25 million in funding from Presbyterian healthcare system. So there is things that are out of the box more than just the mergers.
Yeah. Kevin, we're talking about these deals. Talk to us a little bit about the market for sale merger type transactions. There are players out there now, right? There are bankers. I mean, it's a real marketplace.
You're speaking to one.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
So there's a market, yes, on both sides. We've covered this now for the last hour, that yes, there are institutions that want to be acquired. There are institutions that want to do acquiring. But at least from my perspective, there isn't a system for it. It's the old dating game right now. There's no clearinghouse for this. There's no central broker for this. The work that we do and the work that I've done at my institutions when I was a vice president is really trying to figure out who the players out there, what's the right fit for my institution. Going back to strategy, you can carpet bomb the entire country with solicitations, but that's not the most efficient use of your time, nor theirs. So how do we get to a point where we can advise our institutions, whether they're looking to be acquired or looking to do the acquisition, of using strategy to identify an institution that would make sense for them? And that would be a good use of their money, because you're going to be paying attorneys and advisors to help you with this, and a good use of their time, and a good use of their executives' time, because this becomes a very intense process for the vice presidents on both sides of this, short of having a dedicated team. So I do think that there's a market on both sides, but we are not yet at a point where there's this clear system, and there's a lot of inefficiency built dance between institutions trying to find each other that are a right fit, a viable fit, under a timeline that works for both institutions.
So if you are an institution looking for a partner, how do you do it? How do you find someone?
I would say when we were back in New Rochelle, it was a bit of a shotgun. It was, you read the newspapers and you know that the College of New Rochelle has some financial malfeasance and probably needs some help. But we would all at that point do some outreach to colleagues, people that we knew. The Bloomfield system was much more coordinated. It was identifying, again, through iPads data, 990s, strategic plans, websites, mission statements, what we knew about executives at the institutions, past transactions or a history of a transaction that an institution had done. That's how we sourced institutions. That ultimately, though, I'll admit this, didn't work. Through about 12, 15 months of working with prospective partners and being under non-binding term sheets with a few and going through some due diligence, ultimately did not result in a transaction. But the story behind Bloomfield and what was unique about that is we made the decision one day, coordinatedly, strategically, blow ourselves up. We did an embargoed interview with Inside Higher Ed and told them that we were looking for philanthropic help or a strategic partner. Otherwise, we were likely going to close at the end of the academic year. People thought we were crazy when that embargoed article was released. They thought we were going to get killed by our creditor. We were going to get killed by our bank. But there was a whole pre-strategy of communication with all those entities who applauded what we were doing because it was exactly what we want schools to be doing more of. But for all the reasons that Kevin pointed out, are afraid to do it. You don't want reputational issues. You don't want word to get out that your institution's looking for a partner. You're going to depress your enrollment. You're going to lose staff and everything falls apart. But we coordinated this with all the regulatory bodies, our banking partners and otherwise, launched this, and people that we never thought would be in the market based on our original screening came forward. And I will admit that I said, let's not go to Montclair State University because their new president just started on July 1. We're looking for a partner around October, just a few months later. There's no way in hell a new president is going to take on a transaction in his first few months as president before he's even had his inauguration. And lo and behold, I was wrong because they were the strongest partner. They brought forward the most strategic thought on how they wanted to work with us, sustaining our mission and being collaborative. Our board bought into it. Our leadership team bought into it, and it was successful. So now, as we're advising schools, both on the acquisition side and the requisition side, it's the same process. It really starts qualitatively. I just spoke with the president this week, who, after now being in this space for a few months, and it's likely an institution that unfortunately is going to have to close, but he's been exploring the concept of finding a partner for a few months. He said to me, I'm realizing that the M&A space is 80% psychological and 20% strategic, because whether it's board members, dealing with other institutions, doing this dance, we don't want to give up our name. We don't want to give up our campus. We don't want to give up our mascot. I mean, you're really dealing with some really esoteric things when you're having some of these conversations. But when we're advising schools, because of all of the above, and because you need to get this across the line, we're trying to figure out what's a no-go or a go forward before we even start our process. So it really starts with a qualitative interview process with board members, executive committee members, or otherwise. If it's a religiously affiliated institution, we want to talk to the founding order to get a sense of what's important to them. And then also the executives. And we would like to meet with all the executives, because the president might have one perception, but other executives have unique perspectives as well that gives us nuance and context of what could be successful. And it's with that qualitative research that we spend a little time with that then informs some of the sourcing that we do. Again, going back to iPad screening, like if an institution, and they said this to me a year ago, we need a partner. We'd like to find a partner, but we don't want anybody that's a religiously affiliated school. Just click the box on iPads and they eliminate all the religiously affiliated schools and move on down to different filters that we do. They ultimately changed course on that, and now we're talking to a number of religiously affiliated schools. But coming out of the gates, that was important to them, and they said, we'll never get this past our board if X. And we try to do that with every school, whether they're looking to be acquired or a target. They want something that's strategic, that fits their culture, and that is likely to close. And so we try to use that screening, and then it's this imperfection. I will literally, and I've done this to some people in this room, I will, on behalf of my client, reach out to a president of numerous institutions and say, here's high-level input on what my client is. I can't give you. We round the iPads data, we round the 990s data, because we don't want anybody to reverse engineer it. But we give them some context of what they are, key characteristics that we think would be interesting to a prospective partner. And we say, this is who we're representing. If you'd like to learn more, and many schools don't, because they just don't have. Thanks, but no thanks. We're not in this space. So that's great. That eliminates some work. But then if you're interested, we'd like to engage you in a non-disclosure and introduce the presidents. And for me, I think that's a really critical piece. Kevin talked about it earlier. The idea of trying to do a transaction, and I think we're going to get into this before we conclude, these things take about 2 years to do. And that's just to get to closure, not full implementation. There has to be a level of interface between the two presidents that are going to get this along the lines, because they've got to work hand in glove for an extended period of time with their executive team, with their outside counsel, with their consultants, to pull this all together and manage the internal constituents that are going to be at the gates with lots of questions and anxieties. So the key piece is, once we get somebody interested, it's getting those presidents together to see if there's connectivity there and a compatibility between them to really bring this over the line.
So we're at the, I'll just say, 30-minute mark, and I know we want to leave some time for questions at the end. But this is an important, it takes a village, right, to do one of these deals. As you mentioned, it could take a couple of years, or these are complex organizations. McDonough, let me ask you, when do you engage professionals, financial, legal, real estate, this army of advisors?
So since we still have a lot of material, I'll keep that one short. I think as early as possible, and the obvious ones are the legal and financial professionals. And I would just, there are others, real estate appraisers. I think depending on what's driving the potential transaction, There may be a programmatic consultant. I've seen that with nursing schools where someone who has been through before either establishing or acquiring a nursing school was a consultant in a particular transaction. But I think as soon as you can, and then you should interview them, because there's many excellent law firms and financial advisors that know their field but don't know higher ed, and you don't want them to go through their learning curve on your dime. It's a lot more than a dime for those professionals. So I'd say as soon as possible, and that you interview at least 4 or 5. Right now, I think there's a pretty good collection of national financial advisory firms that have been dealing with mergers and acquisitions in the higher education space. Your particular transaction, for example, if it's one where there's a lot of bond debt involved in, say, the target, you want to have a financial professional and legal professionals who know how to deal with that situation. If there is no debt, then you don't need that particular expertise. But I think that you definitely want to find somebody who has experience and that you feel comfortable with, that you'll be able to work with that person, because it tends to be a 2 to 3 year relationship and a lot of stress. So anyway, that's my short answer. As soon as you can, but I think you need to, almost as soon as you're starting to plan, get your financial and your legal advisors on board.
Kevin, I know you're going to take us into this next piece on describing the basic framework for a deal. Just quickly, Greg, Mike, any follow-ups on the advisor question? Keep moving.
We use scroll and I go to sleep to make.
Fair enough. All right. Well, Kevin, how about walk us through the basic framework for a transaction, please, sir?
Kevin McDonough.
McDonough, yeah.
Well, however you get there that the other Kevin described, where you somehow get to meet, typically a transaction would start with a memorandum of understanding, a letter of intent, something that after you've had some initial discussions, that you just put some concept to paper so you understand just generally what it is that you would be looking to accomplish, a framework. It's just a lot easier in my experience that once you've had some discussions, because those discussions like ping pong balls going all over the place, and if you have something in writing, it's easier to focus, and then easier to expand that. It also helps to crystallize to both parties what the priorities are, what the missions of both institutions are, and how they, whether or not they can meld. And then some point a term sheet where it's more detailed as it's specific to what you're trying to accomplish. And I don't know if I heard this, I think from Michael, but I'm not sure, that the more time you put into a term sheet, whatever your definitive agreement ends up being, a plan of merger and acquisition, or a plan agreement, plan of consolidation, if you have a really clear, detailed term sheet, then the negotiations for the definitive agreement are going to be a lot easier. So.
And I found that hard negotiations, difficult negotiations, tend a difficult relationship. It's just the way of the world. As Kevin said, an LOI, a letter of intent, really encapsulates the formal components of the proposed transactions. It's not exhaustive. It goes into the definitive agreement. It sets the groundwork, and it sets the stage for due diligence, and it sets the stage for a proper modeling of the transaction.
So how do you engage professionals and constitute the team? And I'll just roll in. And when do you involve, faculty union and other unions? I guess Kevin McDonough, for you, I'll throw this to you and to Mike.
I'll say with the union, so some of the consideration with the union, depending on where you are, but all of it is really as early as possible. So you identify where your problems are and what you need to do to get to a resolution of those issues. But with unions, some of the things that you want to know right away is what's in your collective bargaining agreement, what are in your faculty and employee handbooks, and particularly what are the notice requirements of things that are going to be involved. Layoffs, very important aspect, obviously, and those are, just jumping ahead a little bit, those are the things that you might not realize up front are critical in avoiding litigation, because a common aspect of litigation action tends to be with labor, with the employee, with the faculty. And so I think the sooner you can, that's feasible in your particular instance, would be better to avoid problems and to get support for the transaction and avoid litigation.
Right. All right, let's shift over then to the acquirer or buy side, I guess, if you will. And Greg, I'll throw this to you. If you are an acquirer, if you are in that position, how do you approach these transactions?
So I think the really important place to start is actually with yourself, and knowing who you are and what your commitments are, and just as importantly, who you're not. Institutions get into trouble all sorts of times because they're trying to be everything to everyone. And nonprofits, I think, tend to face an even greater challenge than private institutions, because we don't have a simple monetary driven goal. Our objectives are more complex, more dimensional, more disputed. And so it can be too easy to sort of be chasing after this and chasing after that. And so it really requires some work up front to think about what your mission is, what your vision for the entity is. And so as we've started to look a little bit more, as Temple has started to look a little bit more strategically in this space, that's actually where we began our work, was really thinking about, we had strategic plans, we had all of this in place, really focusing on, we're a mission-driven, comprehensive public research institution. What could add value in that space? And then the next layer down was thinking about, okay, well, let's think about what we bring to a partnership. Again, right, trying to think of this not from the distress perspective, but what you're trying to achieve. What pieces do you have to add? Is it your mission? Is it financial strength? Are there other opportunities there? And then we got to the piece about who we're looking for, right? What's the potential entity we may want to acquire and engage and have engaged in what I would describe as real prospecting enterprises along the lines of what Kevin was describing. So developing sort of strategic and financial goals around who we're looking for, and setting up different filters we're interested in, or weighting different categories, running it through publicly available data to identify what kinds of schools we might be interested in looking at. To sort of jump to the chase of the story, I can tell you one interesting thing that came out of this work was really help us focus on what our ideal kind of merger might be. And what we ended up focusing on is that if there was an opportunity with a school that had the smaller entity, real strength in some niche area, that either could bring, or a pretty comprehensive university, but either could bring something new to Temple, or maybe really strengthen an area where we have something, but it's fine. But really focused on a niche, smaller school, maybe because of their size, they're struggling. That sort of was our jewel acquisition. We haven't found it yet, which is not to say there aren't those schools out there. There just aren't those schools out there that are looking for a partnership yet. But it's not the model of what we're doing. But also looking for one where there is mission alignment around social mobility and the students they're trying to help, and then doing those scans. And it's really helped us, as I said, because of our involvement, less than a year ago at the University of the Arts, we get contacted a lot. And having done the prospecting work, and we continue to keep up with that, but it really helps us think when we get approached now by a school that might be distressed or looking for a suitor, or their investment banker or some other person representing them, we can really think quickly through, like, is this a strategic fit for us? Does this work well for us?
Yeah, and you've mentioned that bankers, and folks reaching out to you. I mean, if you're an institution that is interested in a partnership, you've sort of done what you've indicated and figured out who you are and what you're looking for. How do you go out identifying a potential partner, or do you just wait for them all to come in your direction?
So we engage in a process similar to what Kevin described, and having gone through and identified characteristics, we some degree of financial stress would be fine for an acquired entity, but we don't want one that's about to collapse, because it's hard to find synergistic value in that situation. And then we run it through publicly available data, and we actually do essentially 3 levels of scans. We do a very broad scan with general data. That will usually, when we do it, identify a few hundred schools. We look at stuff, we add some more criteria, we get down to a few dozen, and then those we really dig in on and take a look at them. May approach some about that.
Perfect. Mike, talk to us a little bit about the role your financial advisors play when you're in that position.
So we use a due diligence team that is transaction advisory based. Most Big Four firms, and even those falling outside, those audit firms falling outside the Big Four, they all have transaction advisory folks. You want someone that can look under the hood and tell you, just as any merger or acquisition needs due diligence, so to a higher education merger. There are specific questions in a higher education due diligence that are not evident in others, but those questions are relatively few. They are generally, due diligence is just in a box. You go in, they have specific processes, and you'll get a due diligence report. What I find is more compelling than just standard due diligence is a model. You want to know, based on your inputs, how are you going to change what this institution, what the potential target institution, the potential acquired institution is going to look like post-close. That starts with a model, and then you need to line that model with both your back office and front office abilities, and also you need to query the potential acquired entity to see whether your vision for the future will meet their vision for their own institution. And if it does, then you'll have a model that really can look at a 5-year model or a 10-year model that really depicts what the future, the optimal future, can look like.
Got it. So in 5 minutes or less, we're going to try to hit high level, real estate assets, regulatory, and the next 5 years in higher education. So I'll ask Kevin McDonough, if you would, just talk to us a little bit about the sale of real estate and assets.
Sure. So I had a page and a half, and I'll distill it into 5 minutes, and particularly try to focus on what we're here for with how it relates to mergers and acquisitions. So as Aaron said earlier, if you're doing a merger and acquisition, at least in the state of New York, or if you're doing a merger or consolidation, then legally there's going to be a surviving entity, and that surviving entity is going to own all of the assets and the debts. So it'll own the real estate if you go with a merger or consolidation. If you are doing a transaction where you're going to sell the property, then in New York, and assuming we're talking about all or substantially all of the property, and you either have to get the approval of the New York Attorney General alone, which is rare. Typically, if it's a large transaction, they're going to want you to go through the other process, which is that you file a petition with the court for permission to sell on notice to the AG. So the AG will still be involved and still, depending on the transaction, have a lot of questions. I will just say I've had one very, very large transaction with a school that needed to move quickly because they were at risk. And the AG, just in terms of how I think regulatory regulators look at this, the New York AG approved the transaction, even though it was something they typically years ago would have sent to court, which is a longer process, because they were aware of what's happening in New York with schools closing, and they saw an opportunity to help a school not close, and it was successful. I think in terms of transactions, so if you're going to do a merger and a transaction, as I said before, if there's a lot of bond debt, that's going to affect overall the transaction. But if you have bond debt or you just have mortgages on properties, some transactions, and I'm not speaking at a school because I think this is I'm certain that this is public. Iona chose to proceed with Concordia with buying their real estate, and there was a mortgage that had to be paid off, but they just, for their own strategic planning, thought it was better from their perspective as opposed to, and I don't know that they were looking to merge or not, but they thought it was better to buy the campus, pay off the debt, and be a teach-out partner. And that was a successful model for them. And that's an alternative depending upon a lot of factors, including the size of the debt. And I think that's probably going to sum up for real estate. I will just point out that there are transactions that have been in the press where I think they were real estate driven. Villanova University and Cabrini, that was an opportunity for Villanova within the metropolitan area of Philadelphia to acquire real estate. I think similar for Bloomfield and Montclair, they actually did have a very synergistic meeting on wanting to serve underserved students, and so they really was great reasons for doing that merger and its fit. But a primary consideration was that Montclair is 20 miles away from where Bloomfield is in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and Bloomfield is almost a suburb of Newark. And so with that merger, in addition to whatever all the academic reasons were, they were able to acquire a piece of property that was near a train station where they could get proximity to a population of students that might not have been as eager to go to Montclair as they were to Bloomfield. I think that's enough with the time left.
Yep. So with your, well done. So with your leave, I think I can do regulatory in 30 seconds or less. All right, I'll just take it. So suffice to say, mergers and acquisitions in the space are highly regulated. You've got the U.S. Department of Education, the Department of Eds, any funding agency you deal with, veterans, and then you've got your state authorizing entities, you've got your institutional accreditors, your programmatic accreditors. You may also have the state AG. You've got things you're going to have to deal with the IRS. My strong piece of advice is you want both parties to the transaction to have regulatory counsel who can work through all of these things. And these regulatory considerations are material and will almost certainly drive decisions that you make about timing and structure as well. So I would encourage you, engage your regulatory advisors early and get them participating in the process because the regulatory considerations are very significant. Okay. Future predictions from each of you, maybe a minute each, if you or less, something along those lines. Mike, and the question is, what do the next 5 years look like for higher education, presumably in the merger and acquisition context?
And I'm going to do it in 30 seconds. I think I'm hopeful that either United States Department of Education or any national accreditors start a clearinghouse, because they work with these institutions. They know these institutions, and they should be open, and institutions should be open with their accreditor about the needs and the hurdles they face. And if a clearinghouse is established, then that would make this not ad hoc as it now is in higher ed, mostly ad hoc, except if you're using Titan or Kevin's firm, higher ed consolidation solutions. I want to move it out of being ad hoc.
Yeah, very good. Kevin.
Regrettably, I think for all the reasons that I pointed out at the very beginning of all the headwinds that are facing higher education, we're probably in the next 5 years going to see far more closures of institutions than we are mergers of institutions.
Yeah. Greg.
I think that's very much right. I'd say two things quickly. One, it's going to continue to be a challenge space to see productive acquisitions and relationships. And part of that is what we've talked about with boards. Their incentives aren't to sort of financially cash out. They care a lot about the institution. Anything that involves a merger where the school effectively disappears, not exciting. So you'll consider to see that challenge. I do think we'll see a growth of schools that are thinking about this in a coordinated, more sophisticated planned way, repeat players. But that's going to change things at the margins, not going to completely remake the field.
So mine is less a prediction than a hope. I am hopeful that there's going to be less closures than predicted, because I think that the environment, except for the U.S. Department of Education, but within New York, all the regulatory agencies, I think middle states, are much more supportive now of trying to move faster and trying to help facilitate transactions. And I'd recommend for those of you who aren't aware of it, there's on the website from New York State Education Department, a pamphlet or guidance called Guidance for Independent Institutions of Higher Education on Mergers, Consolidations, and Membership. And they state right out of the box that they're aware of the environment that a lot of New York schools are operating in, and essentially that they're trying to do what they can from a regulatory perspective. And what I think even gives me more confidence that this is going to have some impact is that they, as many of you probably know, they changed the rule this summer to allow highly qualified institutions from out of state, like Northeastern. And I think Vanderbilt is doing something or doing something, but I think that there will be more opportunities to strategically have a relationship with somebody, whether it's in state or out of state, that hopefully will blunt all of the closings that have been predicted.
Very good. And I think we still have some time for questions. Questions or answers? Yes, ma'am. Is there do you need the mic? Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a question. I think maybe it's for Kevin McDonough, but anyone's free to weigh in. So, and the only way I can really ask this question is to give So I'm aware of the New York State regulation encouraging qualified out-of-state entities to come and merge with New York State institutions. My question really is, say Harvard wants to come into and take over Ithaca College. I'm making all of this up. My question is, under the reg as I read it, Cornell would never have any input into that decision-making. And I think maybe, that seems odd to me in a state like New York, where in order to create a new nursing program, you have to get input from surrounding colleges and universities on how it might impact their nursing programs. But here, Harvard can come in and partner with Ithaca, and Cornell has no input into that process. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. Is that common in other states? It just seemed odd to me. So thank you.
So I'm going to leave it to the out of stater to comment on other states, but there is no requirement that I'm aware of that you with building buildings or something, you get the community input where you in this particular instance where they have expanded that to allow schools in New York. I think that that's one of the reasons it took so long to get that change, is because behind the scenes, the lobbyists for institutions it was difficult for an out-of-state institution to do anything in New York, separate from mergers, even just to set up an academic program. So I think it's intentional to try to facilitate it, but I also don't think they've given carte blanche. The process that you have to go through, which I not had the experience yet, but you still have to file a charter document with the Board of Regents, and it has to go through an approval process. So they still will be regulated. Harvard can't just take over an institution.
But is there any input from the surrounding institutions, and should there be?
Yeah.
I would say not formally, but informally, because eventually this becomes public. The time that you announce a merger is likely to happen to the time that there's closure. And from firsthand experience, I know that there's other institutions for the very point that you raised, that it's going to change the competitive landscape in the regional area, and it's going to adversely impact. And quite frankly, that is also a driver of some of these transactions, that school wants to talk to a distressed school just as much the reason of avoiding somebody coming in from out of town to their backyard and adversely impacting them, and they might otherwise want interest in that school. So there isn't a formal canvassing yet, but I do think that there's some informal whispers to state agencies and regulatory agencies that people feel a threat. They know of another transaction that's likely to happen that can hurt them. I think in time we might see more of that.
Just briefly, I think there's also a competing interest that if, for example, Wells is out there in an urban area and a region around it that a community was very dependent on it. There was a school from some other state that came in, was willing to do something to keep that campus open. I think that the benefits of that probably outweighed the fact that there was an unintended consequence of a benefit wherever the well students went, somewhere up in that region. There's some other school that benefited from those students. So
I'm not saying it should be outcome determined. I'm just saying there should be some sort of discussion. Awareness.
Yeah, there are a small number of states, and New York's a prime example, where certain changes are at least subjected to a process of public comment, right? So it's not just New York. I would not say it's the majority of states, but in a small number, and it's not just, I mean, it could be a range of things, right? Like say it could be an existing approved institution wants to add a new program or add a new campus, but certainly a change in ownership of an institution. Typically would be before the board. People can come comment on that publicly. That would include other institutions in the state, right? So I do think there are a number of states, and it's not determinative. It's a period of public comment, but it could ostensibly be influential. I mean, whether you think that is a good idea or not, I leave to you all. But I will say 25 years ago, when institutions first started to really get into a distance education in a more meaningful way, there were a lot of states and folks in states who really got up in arms over the idea that, this big flagship university with groups of students, the local so-and-so. And what was interesting is over time, most of those institutions got involved in distance education as well. And so they got a little more comfortable with the idea. And my sense is, given where higher education is going, we talked about this at the outset, right? I mean, you got this contraction, you're going to have, we think, a lot of closures, more. My sense is that there are going to be fewer people who want to throw those stones because we're all going to be living in glass houses, right? So I think there will still be periods of public comment, but I think that the culture is going to be such that most of that will go forward without too much opposition. And who wants to stand up and say, I know that the consequence of my comment may be a lot of people losing their jobs and many students not being able to complete programs, and alumni being upset for the institution is closed, but my school really doesn't like this idea. I mean, no. So yeah, I know, but that's the upshot, right? So I think that we're going to become more comfortable with this in this environment, and you will see less vocal opposition to these kinds of things. That's prognosticate. Who knows? Calling, is it me?
One more.
Yes, sir, please. Thank you. Thanks.
Is there a classic example of a merger in the higher ed space that was absolute or perhaps a catastrophic failure? And if so, what aspects of their strategy caused that failure?
I can't give an example of a construct. I know of deals that didn't go through. I don't know of mergers that were catastrophic.
Yeah. I'm a very outspoken moderator. Here's what I'll say. There are, don't know about so much in the private. Oh, I mean, they have involved nonprofits. There have been a few transactions in recent years where small, one in particular that I'm thinking of, a very small private nonprofit on the West Coast acquired a very large for-profit career school, and the outcome was catastrophic. And I think that was the consequence of having the acquiring organization really they were not an institution, they were a nonprofit, but they had not operated institution. And I think they lacked sophistication. I think they really knew what they were getting into. There have been a handful of transactions in the last decade that I think sort of fit that pattern, where a buyer that was really not a qualified buyer. So this really isn't a merger of like two existing private nonprofit institutions, but it is acquisition activity in the higher education space, right? And the comment's been made earlier, and I think it's really true. For these to be successful, I mean, first of all, it's hard to even get them across the finish line. But for them to be successful, if they get across the finish line, you really have to have an acquiring entity, assuming it's done its diligence, understands, what new partner it's taking on, acquiring entity also has a sophistication to make it, to be able to have that sophistication to make it successful. I think there are a handful of examples where acquirers had the capital and the advisors and managed to get transactions through the regulatory process and across the finish line, but really lacked the experience and sophistication to manage those institutions after the transaction closed. And there were a couple of really catastrophic. Thank you.
You touched on it briefly before, but generally, how are students affected during mergers of schools or closures themselves? And how are the value of the degrees of students that hold degrees from schools that might not exist? How are they practically affected?
I'm pretty sure almost everybody on this panel could answer that question in some degree, but I think if it's a successful transaction, then the students are taken care of. I know we're not focusing on closures, but if you are closing and going to another school, you can get the degree granting authority extended for a period of time for juniors and seniors, so they would get their degree from the school that they came from. And although it may not be the school they chose, ideally, as few students as possible in the transfer process wherever they go. And they're monitored by the National Clearinghouse with the different schools, so they know these statistics. I think the transactions I was involved in had very good results in terms of the graduation rates of the students that went to another institution. But I believe nationally, I might be off, but I think it's like 37%. Only 37% of those students to go on to get a degree when they're at a school that closed. But that's mergers and acquisitions. If you're merging, you'll be a student of that surviving institution. I'll speak to Mike or Greg, maybe have experience as to whether you lose students that just transfer out when there's a merger.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's exactly why it's so important that these relationships, acquisitions, mergers, whatever they are, get handled well. As Kevin was just indicating, there are a lot of different circumstances that can take place, and if it's a sort of clean merger, that will effectuate well for the students. I mentioned the University of the Arts closure in Philadelphia, and that was a lousy situation. The students were sort of left with nothing. The faculty and staff were also left with essentially nothing. A number of those students had paid their deposits or part of their tuition for the bankruptcy, and so they not only don't have a financially. We and a number of other schools in the Philly area did all we can to take those students, support them. Even when a school is closing, the accredited entities will require them to have what's called a teach-out agreement with other schools. So they'll be able to complete their degree in those other institutions and earn their degrees. But it also can be an absolute mess for the students.
Sorry, I'm going to ask a question just because I'm interested in the successful mergers. The Temple that merged or took on the pharmacy school, Philadelphia School of Pharmacy.
That's St. Joe's. Yeah.
So do you have any sense of, did they lose a lot of students when they did that?
University of Sciences acquisition you're talking about?
St. Joe's part of University of Sciences. Yeah. So another piece that happens is if a closure is coming and there's some sort of a transaction, but it's recognized as a closure, often a lot of students will start to leave that school and transfer out, and that takes place. No, I think the acquisition of the University of the Sciences was relatively successful. Certainly some students left, but a number of students stayed with it. So it's very contextual.
All right. I think that brings us to a close. Thank you to our panelists and to Touro University. Thank you all.